Former Labor leader and NDIS Minister Bill Shorten is leaving politics for a career in higher education. Bill Shorten has been a dominant figure in Australian politics for nearly 2 decades, leading Labor to 2 election defeats and serving as a cabinet minister in 2 Labor governments. Political reporter Tom Lowry joins us now from Parliament House in Canberra. Tom, g'day. So this announcement took many by surprise.
Yeah, Joe, there weren't many of the usual whispers you get around Parliament, and even the Prime Minister made the observation that it didn't seem like Bill Shorten was necessarily winding down. He'd been really particularly active in Parliament just in the past few months, but he made the surprise announcement this morning alongside the Prime Minister that he'll be leaving federal Parliament in February. He's going to take up a job as Vice-Chancellor of the University of Canberra. This is a bit of a, I suppose, a blow in some ways for the Albanese government, because Bill Shorten has been a fairly effective minister, particularly just in the past few months as Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. He shepherded through some fairly major reforms to that scheme aimed at reining in some of the costs of the NDIS. He's been an effective communicator for the government for a long time too. It calls time on a long career, 17 years in federal Parliament. Many of them served as Labor leader, of course leading Labor to those 2 election defeats as well. This answers a lingering question too for many in federal politics as to whether Bill Shorten still has eyes on the top job. Does he still want to be Prime Minister at some point in the future? Seemingly the answer is no. During a presser today, Bill Shorten reflected on his time in Parliament, the highs and of course the lows as well, and says he wouldn't change a thing. Here's a bit of what he had to say.
I've experienced some extraordinary political highs in the last 17 years, and let's face it, some extraordinary political lows. But there is not a single day in the last 17 years that I would hand back, because every day I know how lucky I have been to have the privilege to serve the Australian people.
And what have his colleagues and the opposition had to say?
Yeah, many have been paying tribute to Bill Shorten over today, reflecting on that 17 years in public office as a particularly interesting period. He has had a fascinating career. He came into Parliament in 2007 off the back of rising to national prominence during the Beaconsfield Mine disaster back in 2006. He rose to a fairly high rank within the Parliament fairly quickly. He was a cabinet minister in the Gillard government only a few years later. He, of course, played a bit of a factional role in the rolling of Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd and, a few times over during those particularly tumultuous years, then became Labor leader in 2013. He suffered those 2 election defeats as Labor leader, overperforming, some would say, in 2016 against expectations, perhaps underperforming in 2019 when many expected Labor to defeat the coalition in that election. He took a fairly ambitious package of policies to voters in both of those elections, which sort of shaped the national conversation for quite some time there. Anthony Albanese reflected on Bill Shorten's time in public life, finding a social justice thread throughout his time in politics. Here's a bit of what he had to say.
His work has made our government stronger and our nation better. When you think about those 3 things that Bill, up to this point, more to do in his career, will be I think quite rightly praised for his work with the trade union movement, helping working people, his support for people with disabilities and their families and carers, and his support for the victims of robo-debt. They have that social justice thread.
It's always interesting around big political resignations to hear from people's political opponents, to perhaps get a slightly more honest, I suppose, appraisal of what they actually think of the person they've been sparring with for quite some time. And here's what Peter Dutton had to say about Bill Shorten earlier today.
He has contributed an enormous amount to this country during his time with the unions. Everybody will remember his efforts around Beaconsfield, and people have seen him as a local member, a hard-working local member, and somebody who has contributed to a number of governments. He showed a level of dignity and respect to our democratic process that he should be honoured for. So I congratulate Bill on his time in Parliament.
Joe, Bill Shorten will continue as Minister for the NDIS until February. He says there is more work to do in that space over the next 6 months or so before he takes up that job at the University of Canberra. And given the role he's had in public life over quite some time, that might not be the last we hear from him.
OK, Tom Lowry there in Canberra.